Hi everyone, welcome to the clinical reasoning cycle, Thinking Like a Nurse. This process of thinking like a nurse will serve you well in the course as well as after as a registered nurse. Before we begin, what I'd like to do is acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people of the lands in which we meet today. They are the traditional custodians of the land and where we learn, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in the session. Copyright applies as I've indicated elsewhere. So in this session what we're going to do is actually understand the clinical reasoning process or cycle, and it's important to nursing practice. We're going to apply the clinical reasoning cycle to patient scenarios, and there is one scenario embedded in this capture, and then we're actually going to do some more in the clinic in our tutorial. You're going to understand around the development of critical thinking skills and why they are essential for nursing practice, and we're going to connect theoretical knowledge to clinical decision making. So what is clinical reasoning? This is the process by which nurses collect cues, process information, come to an understanding of a patient problem or situation, and then plan and implement interventions, evaluate outcomes, and reflect and learn on from that process. So Tracy Levitt-Jones is fundamental in publishing the clinical reasoning cycle and its approach to clinical practice and the development of clinical judgment is absolutely fantastic, and for that very reason we've actually adopted the clinical reasoning cycle as a method for you to learn and understand about clinical practice. Clinical reasoning is quite distinct from other concepts such as clinical judgment, problem solving and critical thinking because in the clinical reasoning, the approach is a cycle. Clinical judgment is about a conclusion that you have arrived to. Problem solving is one methodology that you apply in gathering and understanding information. And critical thinking, again, is a separate process, is around the asking the why, and we put in practice a number of thought processes. So why is clinical reasoning important? And it's really about ensuring patient outcomes are actually safe and follow that quality framework. What we do is engaging purposeful thinking about patient care, and this purposeful thinking and then action has legal and ethical dimensions to it. It's actually related to the patient because what we're doing is we're gathering data about the patient, from the patient, and what we relate the care requirements to evidence. So our interventions and treatments that we generate in relation to the data that has been collated is all evidence based. So this is an example of the clinical reasoning cycle, and you can see that it's cyclical or spiral in nature, and what you need to do is actually understand what each stage is about. We're always starting from the very top, which is we consider the patient situation, we collect cues and information, we process information, we identify problems or issues, and we establish goals. And from those goals we then take action, and from those actions we then evaluate outcomes that the patient has made. And then what we do is reflect and process on any new learning we need to take account of. So the 8 stages of the clinical reasoning cycle I've now broken down to add some of the context information that we gather. So when we're considering that patient situation, we look at the initial patient assessment and we look at their context and background information that might be relevant. When we're collecting cues or information, we're gathering objective and subjective data, and in the health assessment capture that you've already accessed, you would have had an exposure to what objective data collection is and a subject of data collection. Our sources of information are the patient, the family, or any record. So it really just depends on whether our patient can speak with us and if they're a valid historian, as how we can confirm that subject of data process. But if the patient for some reason isn't a valid historian or is unconscious, we're often going to look at third-party information, that is the family, and of course our medical records. Then we move on to processing information, and here we're actually interpreting and analysing data. We're recognising patterns and relationships within the data, because it's those patterns and relationships that are actually going to help guide us to identify the problems and the issues. And often what we're going to do is actually deal with actual issues, but we then have a number of potential problems or issues that can also arise. And what we start to do is actually prioritise concerns. So the identification of problems or issues that will resolve the patient problem are important outcomes. So having established what those problems are, we're going to set SMART goals for patient care, and we're always going to collaborate our goal setting with the patients, because when we're working with people, it actually is with, and so our process of collaboration becomes fundamental. And that also aligns with the safety and quality dimensions of partnering with consumers, standard number 2. We then, in that cycle, look at how we take action, and we're going to select and implement appropriate interventions. And what we're going to do is actually ensure that whatever decisions or whatever interventions are chosen are always evidence-based. And so that's why one of the skills that you learn in this course is around searching for evidence. When we evaluate outcomes, we are measuring the effectiveness of those interventions, and we're comparing actual versus expected outcomes. So we actually go back to our SMART goals and we look to see whether those interventions actually measured the outcomes that we wanted. And then the last component is that we're going to reflect on that cycle or that process that we've engaged in, and we're going to apply new learning. So often this is a self-assessment and reflection component that you're doing, and you're going to look at considerations or applications for your future practice. Now, critical thinking, I think it's important to differentiate what critical thinking is. And when we're looking at components of critical thinking in nursing context, is that it's purposeful and it's self-regulatory judgment. There is evidence-based approach to problem solving, and there's a reflective and metacognitive process or thinking processes that we engage in. And we also examine our own emotional intelligence and be aware of the biases that we carry. So when we're thinking around the connection to questioning, analysing, synthesising, interpreting, inference, reasoning and applications of that critical thinking, we're often looking at the connection to professional standards. So what are our regulatory requirements? So what do the RN standards for practice ask of us? And then what are the professional development expectations that are required in that process? If you don't have knowledge about one particular aspect of care, how do you remedy that knowledge gap? And then we look at improved patient outcomes and safety. So the linking to the safety and quality areas standards are linked as well. So you can see that just by comparing Tracy Levitz-Jones' cycle, it's quite different to that critical thinking. So critical thinking is embedded within that cycle, and but there are elements that you need to draw out on, and that often is in relation to that reflective component that you're undertaking. So when we're developing clinical reasoning competence, what we have to do is actually examine those factors that influence clinical reasoning competence, and these are the factors that you will actually gain mastery in. So whenever we're looking at problem solving, we're always trying to find the right answer in difficult situations. So the appropriate answers might be varied, but it's the selection of the most appropriate answer in a difficult clinical situation. And often what happens in the beginning is that you will be escalating the findings that you have, so that the people with greater knowledge and practice actually find the appropriate answers. As you gain more knowledge and practice, then you'll find that the answers that you will deliberate with will become a bit more familiar to you, but it won't be until you're a registered nurse that you will be actually actioning some of those answers for difficult clinical situations. The academic self-efficacy, this is the confidence that enables you to overcome challenging situations. So what is it that you need to do to actually remedy your knowledge gaps or your clinical practice gaps, or your confidence generally in transferring knowledge to practice? The level of clinical stress that you may experience when you're in the clinical area can impact your reasoning cycles, reasoning abilities, and that's why it's important to actually really become competent in skills, confident in the delivery of skills, so that when you're actually addressing the patient as the new person in that scenario, you'll find that you have a background of comfort and confidence and competence in that development of clinical skills. Your background and experiences will also influence your clinical competence reasoning development, as your mentorship or preceptorship and the role modelling that you will undertake. So there are strategies that can actually enhance your reasoning skills, and these are very much what we adopt in our laboratory learning as well as our simulation learning. So we use a problem-based learning approach, and so we use simulated patients in the laboratory. So in the laboratory we use the patient folder, and where you will work in pairs to be the patient from time to time during the labs. When we come to our simulation, we also have patient folders, but we actually use patient volunteers who you will talk to and gather information from as methods to improve your integration of thinking and reflection. So simulation also includes debriefing, as our labs also include debriefing. You will do structured reflection activities at the end of each module. Particularly after your laboratory and your tutorial learning, there are some reflective activities that you can include and practice your knowledge development. And then we use in our laboratory sessions, and we use peer feedback as a way of enhancing our reasoning skills. So you will give feedback to your peer, as well as your peer will give feedback to you. And then we also use structured self-evaluation tools in the clinical areas. So you'll be familiar with the use of the ANSET by the end of semester. Okay, so when we're looking at some of the barriers to effective clinical reasoning, we know that there are 4 essential barriers, and these all impact you in different ways, and this is for you to be aware of. So cognitive biases that affect decision making, sometimes there might be anchoring bias, and this is where you focus too much on the initial information and not listen to the ongoing information that the patient actually details. There's also confirmation bias, and this is so seeking only information that confirms initial impressions. So availability bias. This is overemphasizing recent or memorable cases, and there might be premature closing, accepting a diagnosis before verification is complete, and authority gradient. And this is where the person is hesitant to question those in positions of authority. So you can see that cognitive biases can be multiple, and therefore when we're gathering data from our person, or when we're communicating information from that person to the healthcare team, we need to make sure that we've actually addressed all of the potential biases that might influence decisions. Environmental factors also influence, and this is time constraints and high workload. Maybe there are interruptions and distractions, maybe it's information overload, poor communication systems, or inadequate resources or supports. And so this is where that environment, if it's not ideal, it will influence that decision-making outcome as well. Knowledge gaps, and this is where we've got insufficient theoretical knowledge, you've got limited experience knowledge, or you're unfamiliar with the evidence-based practices, or you have difficulty transferring knowledge across sectors. So knowledge gaps, as you engage in more clinical practice and as you bring together all of the learning from the other from the other units that you're learning in each semester, is that you're always building on knowledge for safe practice, safe and evidence-based nursing practice. And the last category which can impact effective clinical reasoning is any emotional or psychological barriers, and this is stress and burnout, fear of making mistakes, lack of confidence, or over emotional involvement with patients. So ways that we can actually overcome barriers is to apply metacognitive awareness training. And so this is your metacognitive processes, this is your thinking processes. So if you have opportunities to actually do some awareness training sessions, I would strongly encourage you to do that. Also using structured reasoning frameworks, so very much using that clinical reasoning cycle as a structured framework to understand how that process of clinical reasoning is applied. You might also want to think about becoming proficient in your health assessment processes so that you have a systematic way in which you are gathering data. Decision-making support tools, and so this is where often you're weighing up decisions and discussing outcomes with people in authority. So clearly when we've gathered data that from an AORC perspective, for example, gives us a risk score that tells us we need to seek support, that decision-making process or a decision-making tree is actually very useful because it helps guide that thinking. It's important that you engage in reflective practice consistently. Every day you're in practice, writing something that was impactful for you, and also methods about how you can improve in clinical practice as well. And what we do is promote psychological safety in all of our learning environments, and we do deliberate practice with feedback. So that engages with your peers and also with your laboratory teachers or your simulation teachers as well. What I'd like you to do is actually suspend the video now so that you can read through this scenario, and so that what you understand is a little bit of context around how we're applying this clinical reasoning case. So suspend the put on pause, put the video lecture capture on pause, and read through the clinical reasoning scenario so that you can apply some of the key questions that will relate with the next slide. Okay, so now that you've actually recaptured the slide or reactivated the video, what I would like you to do is to analyse the previous case study to identify barriers to effective clinical reasoning. And I've given you some clues around these are, there is evidence, these are the potential barriers that have been applied to this case, and this is what I would like you to report on. So why is anchoring bias a potential risk here? How might premature closing actually be a deterrent to effective clinical reasoning? And is there any task fixation or knowledge gaps that need to be identified? Okay, so when we think about the clinical reasoning cycle, it's actually very deliberate. There are 8 stages. You need to be familiar with each of those 8 stages. I would go back and actually look at each of those 8 stages in relation to the case study example, and then you're going to identify how you can potentially draw barriers to that clinical reasoning cycle or methods for overcoming those barriers. The other thing is that you will always be developing these reasoning skills. The more exposures you have in the clinical area, the more exposures you learn from. So that's a great thing. Here are some references that you can actually access, and I look forward to discussing this cycle in the classroom with you.